He collapsed, right there on the cold, sterile floor of the operating room. His breath caught in his throat, not because of the heart condition that brought him there, but because of the name on the badge of the woman who stood above him in surgical scrubs. Dr. Amara Johnson. The name struck him like lightning. The face was unmistakable. The eyes, the nose, features he'd tried to erase from his memory for 25 years. She was the child he had walked away from. A biracial baby girl he had refused to hold, claimed, or even name, all because the color of her skin didn't match his own. Now, she was the only one standing between him and death. How did it come to this? How does a man abandon a life, only to have it save him decades later? This isn't just a story of coincidence. It's a story of consequences, of shame, redemption, and choices that echo across generations. And before we take you into the heart of this story, ask yourself this. If the person you hurt the most held your life in their hands, would you survive? It was the summer of 1999 when Daniel Thompson first heard the words that would forever change his life. She's here, it's a girl. But instead of joy, his heart clenched with something darker, confusion, dread, and a rising panic he couldn't name. His girlfriend, Monique, lay exhausted in the hospital bed, cradling their newborn daughter. Her skin, soft and smooth, carried a shade that neither Daniel nor his family expected. She was unmistakably biracial, and Daniel, white, raised in a small Midwestern town where diversity was more myth than reality, froze. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "We don't mix bloodlines. You know better than that, son." It wasn't supposed to go this way. When he first met Monique, a radiant young woman with ambition in her smile and strength in her stance, it was supposed to be a secret, a phase, maybe even a rebellion. Love wasn't in the plan. Commitment definitely was. But Monique, with her quiet grace and steady heart, had chipped away at his walls. Still, the weight of expectations and unspoken rules never truly left Daniel's shoulders. And when faced with the living, breathing evidence of his defiance, a child who bore both his blood and a skin tone that would make his family whisper, Daniel made a decision he would never stop paying for. He didn't hold her, didn't name her, didn't sign the birth certificate. He left, quietly, cowardly. He told Monique he wasn't ready, that this was too complicated, that he needed time. But the truth was far uglier. He couldn't bear to bring home a black child to a family who still talked about keeping the bloodline clean. His mother would have wept from shame. His father might have disowned him. And somewhere inside, Daniel told himself he was sparing everyone pain. Monique never begged. She just looked at him, eyes hollow, face pale from labor, and whispered, "You'll regret this." Years later, Daniel would admit to himself that she was right. Back then, though, the world was simpler, or at least his corner of it was. No one asked too many questions. He moved on, built a life wrapped in illusions of normalcy, married a white woman his parents approved of, had 2 more children, bought a house with a white picket fence. But guilt has a way of whispering in quiet hours. Sometimes it came to him in dreams, dark hallways, a child crying behind a locked door. Sometimes it arrived when he least expected, during church sermons on grace, when watching interracial families laugh in a grocery store, or when holding his newborn son and realizing the love he had denied to his daughter. And while Daniel buried the past, Monique lived it. She named the baby Amara, Swahili for grace. It was both a promise and a prayer. A promise that her daughter would live in dignity, and a prayer that the world would one day see her for her worth. Raising a black girl as a single mother was never easy, especially in a society quick to judge, slow to understand. Monique faced it all. When Amara was 5, a preschool teacher assumed she was adopted. At 8, other parents whispered about that girl with the absent white daddy. By 12, Amara asked why she didn't have any pictures of her father. Monique always gave her the truth, softened by kindness. He couldn't see what I saw, but one day, maybe, he'll open his eyes. But Amara didn't wait for that day. From a young age, she was determined to become someone. She buried herself in books, devoured science documentaries, and whispered big dreams to the stars at night. She didn't need a father to tell her she was worthy. She had a mother who reminded her every single day. In high school, she graduated valedictorian. In college, she studied pre-med with a fire that few professors had ever seen. And when she got accepted into one of the top medical schools in the country, she didn't celebrate with champagne. She took a quiet walk alone and whispered, "You were wrong about me." Meanwhile, Daniel's world remained painfully unaware. He didn't know the little girl he abandoned had become a woman of steel and heart. He didn't know the choices he made in cowardice had birthed a force of resilience. He didn't know, but that would soon change. The tragedy of racial shame isn't just about personal bias. It's about what it steals. It stole Amara's chance at having a father. It stole Daniel's opportunity to love someone who might have taught him more than any book or sermon ever could. And it stole from society the example of what healing might look like, had courage prevailed. Even now, there are thousands of Daniels walking away from Amaras, not because they don't love, but because fear is louder than love in a world where racism still breathes through quiet rooms and closed-door conversations. But this story, raw as it is not just about regret. It's about what happens when the past comes back, not for revenge, but for reckoning. Because while Daniel thought he had buried his mistake, fate had a different plan. And it began the day his chest started to tighten. A routine jog turned into breathlessness. A checkup revealed blocked arteries. The doctor scheduled emergency surgery. The hospital was unfamiliar, but it was one of the best. He trusted the doctors. He didn't look closely at their names until he did, until she walked into the room, until he saw her eyes, and by then it was too late to run. Amara never remembered the warmth of a father's arms. There were no bedtime stories read in a deep, comforting voice, no shoulders to ride on during parades, no strong hands lifting her up after she'd fallen. Her world was built around the absence of someone who should have been there. And in that void, her mother, Monique, became everything: parent, protector, provider, and quiet warrior. They lived in a small, two-bedroom apartment on the edge of a city that never quite decided whether it was growing or dying. Rent was always just a little too high, groceries stretched with creativity, and electricity a monthly battle between bill and paycheck. But somehow, Monique made it work. She worked 2 jobs, daytime as a receptionist at a dental clinic, evenings cleaning offices. At night, after Amara had fallen asleep, she would sit at the kitchen table in silence, staring at the flickering light above, often too tired to even cry. Amara, even as a child, sensed the weight her mother carried. She learned not to ask for expensive toys, not to cry over things they couldn't afford, and not to wonder too loudly about the man who wasn't there. But kids always wonder, and though Monique never fed her bitterness, the truth seeped in through the cracks of silence. She knew her father was white, she knew he left, and she knew he never came back. School was both a haven and a minefield. Amara was bright, too bright sometimes. While other kids giggled through multiplication tables, she was reading anatomy books borrowed from the library. Teachers praised her, but classmates didn't always understand her. Some called her a know-it-all. Others made cruel jokes about her skin, her hair, the absence of a father at parent-teacher nights. "I bet your dad's in jail," one boy sneered in 5th grade. "No," she shot back, eyes burning. "He's probably hiding. Cowards do that." At home, she never mentioned the insults. Monique already had enough battles, but each comment carved something deeper inside her, a resolve to become untouchable. She didn't want pity, didn't want excuses. She wanted to rise so high no one would dare look down on her again. And so she did. By the time Amara reached high school, she was already tutoring other students in biology, organizing STEM clubs, volunteering at free clinics on weekends. Teachers called her the future. Counselors whispered about Ivy League potential. But it wasn't just academics that shaped her. It was the understanding that she was navigating a world that didn't always see her as enough. Being a young black girl in predominantly white academic spaces meant walking a tightrope. Too confident and she was intimidating. Too soft-spoken and she was insecure. Too ambitious and she was aggressive. There were times she felt invisible and others when she felt hypervisible, but never just seen. Still, she pressed forward, not because the path was smooth, but because turning back would mean letting someone else write her story. One afternoon during her junior year, she stood at a bus stop in Scrubs, just after shadowing a heart surgeon at the local hospital. An elderly woman looked her up and down and asked, "Are you a nurse?" Amara smiled politely. "No, ma'am, I'm going to be a heart surgeon." The woman raised her brows and muttered, "Well, good for you." But the undertone was unmistakable, disbelief dressed in condescension. That moment stayed with her. It wasn't the first time and wouldn't be the last that someone questioned her dreams simply because of who she was, or rather, what they assumed she was. But Amara didn't flinch. She went home, opened her textbooks, and studied until dawn. Monique often watched her daughter with quiet awe. Where she had been broken, Amara seemed to build. Where she had been hardened by rejection, Amara created something luminous. One evening, as Amara sat at the kitchen table, her space now covered in anatomy flashcards and highlighters, Monique placed a cup of tea beside her and whispered, "You're everything he couldn't handle. That's his loss, baby, never yours." It wasn't until college that Amara began to openly explore the idea of her father again, not as a missing figure, but as a symbol of everything she had risen above. She met other students with complicated families, biracial identities, fractured roots. Through late-night dorm conversations and campus counseling sessions, she realized something powerful. She didn't need his apology to be whole. Still, part of her sometimes imagined what it would be like to see him. Would he recognize her? Would he deny her again? Would he cry, apologize, beg for forgiveness? Or would he say nothing at all? But the bigger question was this: would she forgive him? Because that was the secret no one tells you about abandonment. It leaves you with power. The power to carry resentment or release it. The power to become what you were denied. The power to write your own ending. So when Amara walked across the stage at her medical school graduation, wearing her white coat and holding her diploma, she wasn't just celebrating an achievement. She was closing a chapter. She didn't know that fate had one more twist waiting. That the man who had turned his back on her would soon lie unconscious on a hospital bed, needing the very heart she had built a life protecting. But even then, even before the moment their paths would collide again, Amara had already won. Because despite the silence, the absence, the hurt, she had become everything she was told she couldn't be. A healer, a leader, a daughter of strength. She didn't grow in her father's shadow. She outgrew it. The hospital was quiet that morning, the kind of calm that settles just before the day erupts into alarms, emergencies, and running footsteps. Amara, now doctor, Amara Johnson, stood by the window of the cardiac wing, sipping black coffee as the sun painted soft streaks of gold across the sterile walls. Another day, another surgery, another heart in her hands. She'd done this dozens of times, but this one, something about it felt heavier. Her patient was already prepped in the OR, male, 53, presenting with advanced coronary artery disease. The note said he'd collapsed during a routine jog, his EKG lit up like fireworks. Classic blockage, triple bypass needed. Nothing she hadn't handled before. But the name, Daniel T., stirred a strange flicker in her chest, one she couldn't place. She shook it off. Names had stopped mattering a long time ago. Across the hospital, Daniel Thompson lay unconscious on the operating table, surrounded by a blur of machines and masked professionals. He didn't know that fate had carried him to the edge of his past. Didn't know that the surgeon assigned to save him was the same daughter he had once left behind in a hospital room, wrapped in silence and shame. Life has a way of looping back around, sometimes with a whisper, sometimes with a roar. The hospital, like life, is full of invisible intersections. Stories pass each other in hallways, destinies brush shoulders without ever noticing. But not today. Today, two lives would collide, and only one of them knew what was coming. Amara scrubbed in with her usual calm, hair tied back, mind laser-focused, voice steady as she gave instructions to the OR team. Everything about her posture radiated discipline and command. She was one of the best in her field, known for precision and composure under pressure. But as she glanced at the chart again, her eyes snagged on something. Daniel Thompson. Blood type AB+, allergies, penicillin. Emergency contact, none. Something in her gut twisted. A memory, uninvited, unspoken, bubbled up from the depths. Her mother once, at age 16, clutching a stack of hospital paperwork, sighing under her breath. Daniel Thompson, AB positive, allergic to penicillin. Funny the things you memorize about someone who walks away. Her heart skipped. No, it couldn't be. Amara froze. The room moved around her, nurses adjusting lights, anesthesiologist preparing, but she stood perfectly still, the world narrowing to that one name. She slowly approached the table. The man was unconscious, hooked to monitors, his face pale and aged but still sharp at the jaw, still carrying the echo of old photographs she'd found once in her mother's drawer. Her hands, usually so sure, trembled. There he was. Her father, the man who had left before she took her first steps. The man who vanished so completely she sometimes wondered if he had been real. And now he lay before her, chest open, heart failing, not just in the literal sense, but in all the ways a heart can fail a life. She felt breathless. For a moment she didn't know whether to scream, to cry, to walk away. A storm surged inside her, years of abandonment, unanswered questions, quiet birthdays, school plays with one empty seat. All of it rushed to the surface like a wave crashing through glass. Her fingers tightened into fists inside her gloves. But then she looked closer. He was just a man now. Fragile, mortal, not a monster, not a villain, just broken. And somehow, beneath the ache, a strange calm began to rise. Amara had spent her whole life preparing to become someone capable, powerful, unshakable. And now she faced the ultimate test, not of skill, but of character. Would she let the past guide her hand, or would she rise above it? She glanced at her team. "Let's begin," she said, voice sharp, clear, and steady. Scalpel in hand, she leaned in. She wasn't just repairing a heart today. She was deciding what kind of heart she had. The operation began like any other: incision, retraction, exposure of the heart. But inside, Amara was navigating two operations at once, one physical, one emotional. With every stitch, every clamp, every careful movement, she stitched together something inside herself as well. A piece of healing, perhaps, a thread of dignity where pain once lived. No one in that room knew, not the anesthesiologist, not the nurses, not the assistants. No one knew that the surgeon was operating on the man who had once operated out of her life. And still, she gave him her best. The bypass was textbook, 3 arteries rerouted. Heart function stabilized. As she closed the incision and removed her gloves, Amara stood over him one last time before stepping out of the room. He was still unconscious, unaware of the truth that hung in the air like unspoken thunder. She stared at him, whispering quietly, "You don't know who I am, but I know who I am, and I think that's enough." Outside the OR, Amara leaned against the wall, eyes closed, heart pounding. A nurse walked by and asked if she was okay. She smiled just slightly. "Yeah," she whispered, "I'm good." But the real reckoning hadn't begun. Not yet. Because hours later, when Daniel awoke, groggy and blinking against the harsh hospital lights, he would turn to the nurse beside him and croak out the words, "Who was my surgeon?" And when she pointed to the name on the chart, Dr. Amara Johnson, everything would begin to unravel. The name would hit him like a bolt of lightning. He'd remember Monique, the birth, the baby girl he never held. He'd do the math. 25 years, the same last name, the impossible coincidence that wasn't coincidence at all. And then, just like that, Daniel Thompson would feel something he had outrun for decades, truth catching up. He would ask to see her. He would want to speak. But what do you say to the person you once abandoned when they just saved your life? The world came back to Daniel in fragments. First the beeping of machines, then the dull ache in his chest, then the sterile scent of antiseptic and latex gloves. He blinked slowly, as if dragging himself up from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. The room was quiet, dimly lit, a single monitor blinking beside him in steady rhythm. He was alive. Barely, but alive. The nurse noticed him stir and walked over, checking his vitals with professional efficiency. "You're awake," she said softly. "You made it through. Surgery went well." Daniel's throat was dry. He rasped, "Surgeon, who was?" She glanced at the clipboard. "Dr. Amara Johnson, one of our best. You were in good hands." And just like that, the name cracked something inside him. Amara Johnson. His heart skipped, literally and figuratively. For a moment, he wasn't lying in a hospital bed, but standing in a delivery room 25 years ago, too much of a coward to hold his daughter. He heard Monique's voice again, not angry, just tired. "You'll regret this." And here he was, chest stitched back together by hands he never held. It couldn't be, could it? He whispered again, this time with urgency. Can I see her?" The nurse hesitated. "I'll ask." An hour passed, maybe two. He drifted in and out, trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with the impossible idea forming in his head. Then, the door opened, and in walked the woman who had held his heart in her hands, both literally and metaphorically. Amara stood tall, her white coat buttoned, her stethoscope slung around her neck, her expression unreadable. She looked every bit the professional, polished, composed, prepared. But her eyes, they held history, his history. For a long moment neither spoke. Daniel's voice cracked. "Amara, is that you?" She didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at him like someone standing in front of a burning house they once called home. He tried again. "You're her, you're my daughter." She let out a soft exhale. "Yes." The word hung in the air like thunder. Daniel's face contorted, shame, disbelief, awe, and something like guilt clawing up his throat. I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know it was you. I never thought," he trailed off, the weight of his own words choking him. "You never thought I'd become someone worth noticing." She offered, her tone calm but sharp as glass. He flinched. "I was young. Scared," he began, but she cut him off. "No, you were weak." Her voice didn't tremble. "You weren't the first man to walk away from his child, but you might be one of the few who got to lie on her table, begging for time you once threw away." Daniel looked away. "You have every right to hate me." "I don't hate you," she said quietly. "I stopped needing you a long time ago." He swallowed hard. "But you saved my life." She nodded once. "Because I'm a doctor. Not because I'm your daughter." And there it was, the cleanest cut, sharper than any scalpel. Daniel felt the tears rising before he could stop them. He turned back to her, his voice breaking. "Do you want to know why I left?" "No," she said simply. "I already know. You left because I didn't fit the world you came from, because I was a mirror you didn't want to look into, because fear and shame were louder than love." He nodded slowly, painfully. "That's true." Silence stretched between them like a wound neither of them could stitch. Finally, Amara stepped closer. "Let me ask you something. What would you have done if I wasn't here? If someone else had done the surgery?" Daniel hesitated. "I'd be dead, I guess." She nodded. "Yeah, you would." He looked up at her, his eyes glassy. "Do you believe in second chances?" She paused. "I believe in accountability," she replied. "Redemption is earned. It's not a story you tell, it's a life you live." Daniel closed his eyes. Her words weren't cruel, they were honest. And that somehow hurt more than rage ever could. "I want to know you," he said softly, "if you'll let me." Amara tilted her head, studying the face of a man who had shaped her life by not being in it. She searched for sincerity, for regret, for truth. Finally, she spoke. "You want to know me. Start by learning who I am, not just what you missed. Don't come with guilt, come with respect." Daniel nodded, a silent vow forming in the space between them. She turned to leave, her hand already on the door. But then she paused and looked back. "You were right about one thing," she said. He looked up, surprised. "I did become someone," she said, her voice softer now. "Not in spite of you, because of you. Every time you disappeared, I grew stronger. Every time you stayed silent, I found my voice. So if you want a second chance, don't waste it trying to rewrite the past. Use it to honor the future." And with that, she walked out, leaving Daniel alone, broken open but breathing. In that moment, he realized something deeply, painfully true. Sometimes the person you abandon becomes the very person you need most. And if you're lucky, really lucky, they just might save your life. But they won't owe you their heart. That you'll have to earn. That night, Amara sat alone in the hospital's rooftop garden, the hum of the city below barely cutting through the fog in her chest. The wind was soft, brushing against her skin like a whisper, but inside her, a storm was raging. Hours had passed since she had stood face to face with the man who gave her life and left her to live it without him. Her father was still recovering, his heart now beating with the help of arteries she had repaired. But her own heart, it felt tangled, raw, torn between justice and mercy. Forgiveness wasn't a light switch. It wasn't a one-time act. It was a process, messy, complicated, and deeply personal. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, Amara didn't feel in control. She had spent her entire life mastering the unpredictable, studying tirelessly, perfecting her surgical techniques, making herself invulnerable to failure. She learned early on that emotion could cloud judgment, that logic and preparation were the only paths to success. But nothing in her textbooks had prepared her for this. How do you heal from something that never apologized? She closed her eyes and thought of her mother, Monique, who had wiped away her tears without ever crying her own, who had carried the weight of abandonment while keeping her daughter's head held high. Monique had never spoken Daniel's name with bitterness, but also never glorified him with hope. "He made his choice," she used to say, "but so did we." Amara wondered what her mother would say now, knowing that the man who left them had come crawling back not with words, but with failing arteries and a quiet desperation to matter again. She remembered the look on Daniel's face earlier, how regret had aged him more than time ever could. His voice, ragged with emotion, trembling as he asked for a second chance. Part of her wanted to scream at him. Part of her wanted to walk away forever. And yet, another part, a quieter part, whispered something different. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about him. Maybe it wasn't about making peace with his choices, but making peace with hers. Still, it wasn't that easy, because beneath the surface, the child in her still existed. The little girl who scanned the crowd at school plays for a face that never showed up. The teenager who sat quietly during Father's Day assignments while her classmates wrote poems and drew pictures. The med student who wanted, just once, to hear someone say, "I'm proud of you," and know they meant it not as a teacher or mentor, but as family. Could that girl ever forgive? She thought of the patients she had treated over the years, men and women who came in with broken bodies and broken stories, abuse survivors, veterans, people who had been betrayed by family, by systems, by life itself. Some forgave, others didn't, and both choices were valid. Forgiveness wasn't proof of goodness. It wasn't a medal. It was a door, and not everyone had to walk through it. Amara leaned back against the bench and looked at the stars. What would forgiveness even look like? She whispered aloud. Would it mean inviting him into her life, into her future? Could she sit across from him over coffee, listen to his regrets without bleeding all over again? Would she ever introduce him to her future children, say, "This is your grandfather," and not flinch at the irony? Or would it simply mean letting go, releasing the anger, the ache, the unanswered questions, not for his peace, but for hers? She thought back to what she told him earlier. Redemption is earned. It's not a story you tell, it's a life you live. And she meant it. If Daniel wanted to be more than a scar in her history, he'd have to prove it. Not in one tearful conversation, but in consistent, difficult, unglamorous effort. But before that, she had to decide something even harder. Was she willing to let go of the narrative she had carried for so long? Because the truth was, her pain had become a part of her identity. The absence, the rejection, the drive to prove herself, it had all fueled her success. She had turned abandonment into ambition, and without it, who would she be? She sat in that question for a long time. Then slowly she pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She typed a message, erased it, typed again. Finally she wrote, "You survived, that's step one. Step two is learning how to show up. For now, rest. We'll talk again, maybe." She hit send. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't forgiveness. It was a beginning. The next day she visited his room again. Daniel looked weaker but more alert. He turned to her, hope flickering in his eyes. She didn't sit, didn't stay long. "I don't have answers for you," she said, "and I'm not ready to rewrite history. But I'm willing to watch what you do next." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand." "No," she said firmly. "You don't, not yet, but maybe one day you will." She walked out, her posture strong, her steps steady. For the first time, the burden felt just a little lighter. She hadn't forgiven him, but she had reclaimed the narrative. And sometimes that's the most powerful act of all, because forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering and choosing peace anyway. Life has a way of bringing us full circle, not always to grant closure, but to challenge the stories we tell ourselves about pain, about love, and about what it means to heal. For Amara, the story didn't end in forgiveness or reconciliation. It didn't end with dramatic hugs or promises to start over. It ended with truth, and that was enough. Truth that wounds don't always close cleanly. That not every apology comes wrapped in timing or grace. And that sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do is simply choose not to carry the weight of someone else's failure anymore. Daniel may never fully earn his place in her life. He may never be the father she needed. But what he did, whether out of guilt, regret, or awakening, opened a door. Not for redemption, but for reflection. He became the living reminder of a world where prejudice steals possibilities, and shame silences love before it ever speaks its name. And yet, out of that brokenness, a woman rose, a daughter forged in fire, a healer shaped not just by textbooks but by experience, pain, and perseverance. Amara's story isn't just about abandonment, it's about transformation. About how a girl without a father became a woman who could hold her own power, not just in the operating room, but in life. So what do we take from this? We take the reminder that our actions echo further than we imagine. That leaving isn't neutral. That silence speaks. That shame, if not confronted, becomes a chain passed from generation to generation. But we also take this. Healing is possible, not always in the ways we expect, not always wrapped in happy endings, but in the small, quiet moments when someone chooses dignity over bitterness, strength over spite, peace over pain. If you've been hurt by a parent, a partner, a system, this story is yours too. Not because your pain matches hers, but because your power does. You get to decide what to carry and what to lay down. You get to write the next chapter. And if you've been the one who walked away, let this be your mirror. It's never too late to take responsibility. But don't expect easy roads. Expect to listen. Expect to change. And understand that sometimes the greatest grace someone will ever show you is not shutting the door entirely. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about who we once were. It's about who we choose to become, starting now.